4.
Order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 6th of November 2024. And we're delighted to welcome the first time for this Treasury Select Committee the Chancellor of the Exchequer to explain and answer questions about last week's budget. And I think it is worth saying what a breakthrough it is that we have a first woman Chancellor ever, and proud we are to have her in front of the Treasury Select Committee. And Chancellor, that's the good bit. So take that, because we're going to then move into questions. And the Chancellor, the Right Honourable Rachel Reeves MP, is joined by James Bowler, the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, and by Will McFarlane, the Director of Strategy, Planning and Budget at the Treasury, and by Conrad Smewing, the Director General for Public Spending, and who's also the joint head of the Government Finance function at the Treasury. So warm welcome to you all. Chancellor, if I can just kick off, when you look at the OBR's approach and growth forecast for your budget plans, it's not as optimistic perhaps as you have been. So are you confident that you will see the growth that you've predicted and that you ran for election promising?
Well, thank you very much, and it's a real privilege and a pleasure to be here today to take questions from your committee. Growth is number one mission of this government, and something that we are determined to deliver, because in the end it is economic growth that drives up living standards and ensures that we have the money both to keep taxes down and to invest properly in our public services. The forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility shows an uptick in economic growth in the first couple of years in the forecast before it starts to fall back a little bit. But then over the longer term, the Office of Budget Responsibility says that if we keep capital spending at the levels that we've set out for the duration of this Parliament, that could lift economic growth by 1.4% by boosting the supply side capacity. Now, that is the first time that the Office of Budget Responsibility have looked at economic growth prospects beyond the 5-year period of the Parliament. And I think that's really welcome, because there is a tendency, I think, for politicians for whichever party to take decisions that can affect outcomes in one Parliament rather than looking to the long term. And part of what we spoke about in the election campaign about country first, party second, is about putting our country on the right path for the future, which is why unlocking that capital investment is so important. But am I happy with the growth profile for this Parliament? No, I'm not. I want growth to be stronger. I want it to come through faster. And crucially, I want it to be felt by families and businesses up and down the country. And we've got policies in train to deliver that economic growth.
You think that your policies will trounce the OBR's growth forecast?
Well, that's certainly our ambition. And you had Richard Hughes and the Office of Budget Responsibility team here yesterday, and I want to thank them for all of their work that goes into the forecast process. And I think that they said to your committee that one upside to their growth forecast is the planning reform that we have begun work on. So on day 3, I think it was, of being Chancellor, I gave my first speech at the Treasury where we started the overhaul of the planning system. So we called in a number of planning decisions.
Just stop you there, because of course you've announced that. We'll come into that in a bit more detail. But what they were just to be clear about what they said is that they couldn't factor that in at this point because it's too early days. So you're saying us very clearly and boldly today that you are very confident that the changes in planning will bring growth in this Parliament at a higher rate than the OBR.
Yes, and the OBR said it was an upside risk to their growth forecast. But we're only less than 4 months when the OBR put together their forecast into this new government, and we've got more work to do to deliver on that growth mission. But when I talk to businesses, big and small, they say that the two things that are most important is, first of all, bringing stability back to the economy. Well, this budget brings stability back. We've drawn a line under the sort of chaos and instability of the last few years. But second, they want planning reform so they can get things done. We can get Britain building again. And that's what our plans for growth hinge on. And that's what, now that this budget is sort of out of the way, like the Treasury is not just a department for delivering budgets. It might have felt like it the last few years, the number that you went through, but the department is about so much more than that. The department is about driving economic growth and prosperity in all parts of the country, and planning reform, as well as pensions reform, skills reform, our devolution agenda, are all about securing that number one mission of this government.
That's a strong plan. Did you want to come in? Briefly, yes.
I can come in briefly. So what Professor Miles was clear about is that they were not able to factor in the impact of planning reform into their forecast, which we took to understand to be that there were, as you described, an upside risk. But I'm interested in how you interpret that as only a positive, because I think it could be quite a big sensitivity as well.
Yes, look, our growth plans are not just about planning, but I honestly believe after stability, planning is the biggest thing that we can do as a government to unlock growth, whether that's into energy infrastructure, digital infrastructure, transport.
Just that in specific answer to the question, you're seeing it as a positive. You're not worried about any downsides, about slow delivery on this.
No, I think this is all upside because they don't take into account our planning reforms. And I just want to say that that's not a disrespect that I'm giving to the OBR. This is early on in the process. We're developing that work. We've already called in a number of planning decisions. We got rid of the effective moratorium on onshore wind. So, we're doing things, but the OBR want more evidence. They want us to do more to show the impact that our planning reforms can have. And that's a challenge for me and the Treasury and this government to show the impact that planning reform can have. I'm confident we can do that.
Okay, thank you. John Glenn, MP.
Thank you. Before I ask my questions, I would just, on behalf of my party and personally, like to congratulate you on securing the position of Chancellor. Having worked for 4 Chancellors quite closely, I know what an exacting role it is, and whatever questions I ask, I have respect for you in getting to this position. Can I ask you about the news today from the US and the implications of it for growth? Because Goldman Sachs have cut their expectation of growth next year from 1.6 to 1.4% for the UK economy, citing potential tariff risks. And I think the EU too. EU officials are forecasting a reduction in EU exports to the US of 150 billion euros. 10% fall in the value of the euro and a cut in GDP of Germany, for example, 1.5%. How do you accommodate that in your plans going forward? And perhaps just link to that, if I may, Chancellor, in terms of could you clarify what is the UK's growth target? It's been variously, I think, expressed as 2%, 2.5%, 3%. It'd be useful for the committee if you could tell us what that is.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, John Glenn, for what you said. And we were opposite each other at the dispatch box for a number of years. And I think you know the esteem within which we hold you, my party holds you, and how much we enjoyed facing you, if that's the right word, across the dispatch box. And I look forward to taking questions from you today and in future at this select committee. I think it is too early to start making changes to forecasts for our economy because of the election of a president in the United States. But I would say this, our trading relationship, our economic relationship with the United States is absolutely crucial. The US are our single biggest trading partner. Trade between our two countries, I think, at £311 billion a year. So, of course, that relationship is crucial. And our special relationship obviously goes much beyond trade for our security and defence relationship as well. And I'm confident that those trade flows will continue under the new president. And indeed, President Trump has been president of the United States before, and we continue to have a strong and healthy economic relationship. And we, as a government, will continue to make the case for free trade. We are an open trading economy. We benefit from that with our trading relationships with Europe, with the Middle East, with Asia, and of course with the United States as well. You also asked about our growth target. Well, in our manifesto, our number one mission was to have the highest sustained growth in the G7 with good jobs and productivity in all parts of the country. And the reason we chose that metric rather than picking a number was because we saw in the last Parliament you have the invasion of Ukraine, you have a pandemic, and then an arbitrary growth number wouldn't be the right approach. So the reason we compared it with similar countries is because regardless of the shocks, those shocks are often global shocks, so it's where are we in the league table rather than an absolute number.
Can I just come back on that? And I totally respect day one. It's unrealistic to have a thorough view of that, but those are quite stark revisions to growth expectations of the UK economy by respected sources. And so I think it will be interesting to say the least, to secure a view from the Treasury about what those tariffs will mean. It seems to me we've got a US president who won't be facing election again, with a strong mandate and support from Congress. And if he goes down that route, the implications will be quite severe. Could I just, and I hear what you're saying about the growth target, could I ask about the interaction of the preparation for the budget with the growth mission boards? During the general election campaign, the mission boards were front and centre of what you were talking about. Did they need to consider the package? Is there a sort of a remit and a schedule for those mission boards in order to secure the execution of what you're trying to secure? And obviously, if you don't know now, you could write to the committee.
Yes. So look, on this point about the US, we're not just a passive actor in this. It's a trade relationship with the United States, and we will make strong representations about the importance of free and open trade, not just between ourselves and the United States, but globally. And the US also benefit from that access to free and open trade with us and other countries around the world, and it's what makes us richer as societies to benefit from that
I might be
open
sympathetic
trade.
to that, but is it realistic to influence a president who's so set on a course that is so well defined?
Oh, well, look, we've got another a couple of months before the inauguration. Obviously, we will begin those conversations. We'll prepare for different eventualities, but I absolutely do not want to sound in any way sanguine. On the other hand, I am optimistic about our ability to shape the global economic agenda as we have under successive governments. I've forgotten what
mission boards.
Oh, the mission boards. Yes, so we've had 2 or 3 meetings of the Growth Mission Board, which I chair. I think we've got about 4 or 5 permanent members of other cabinet members, and then other cabinet members attend based on our discussions. The next meeting of the Growth Mission Board is later in November, and that is to discuss the role of place in our economic agenda. You will have seen in the budget last week the announcement of single settlements with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and with the West Midlands Combined Authority. And our next meeting is taking place in Darlington, as you know, the Darlington Economic Campus. Yes, see you in Darlington soon, Lola McAvoy. We will make sure at that meeting that we've got representation, for example, from our mayors, because delivering growth is not just a government mission, it is on our national mission, and we know that we cannot just deliver growth from Westminster or Whitehall. We've got to engage business leaders, local leaders in that, which is why we're meeting not just in London, but around the country and involving key actors. In fact, actually, the last meeting we had the chair of the National Infrastructure Council, our Growth Mission Board. I did not take the Growth Mission Board through a detailed account of what was going to be in the budget. That wouldn't be appropriate. But in terms, I set out the 7 pillars of our growth strategy in the budget last week, and obviously the number 1 pillar is stability. Those 7 pillars are something that we work together with the Growth Mission Board to develop.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Chair.
you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fairman. Harriet Baldwin, MP.
Thank you, Chair. And can I add my congratulations on your appointment and appreciate, as you will, just how much power and responsibility you have now, particularly with 400 MPs to vote through any measures that you wish to implement. And I recognise the fact that one of the aspects of the financial world that you don't control is the markets, though. And the Office for Budget Responsibility yesterday was telling us that the additional £350 billion of public spending that was announced in your budget has permanently increased, in their opinion, the level of interest rates and inflation. And what steps did you take before the budget to reassure yourself that at a time when the Bank of England's also selling gilts, that the gilt market would be able to cope with that additional level of public spending?
We've had, I think, we had an auction of government gilts yesterday, and that was, very comfortably oversubscribed, which is very welcome. But if you look at the forecasts from the Office of Budget Responsibility, both for interest rates and inflation over the course of this Parliament, both of them are on a downward trajectory. If you take inflation, of course, it peaked at just over 11% in the last Parliament. The peak of inflation forecast by the OBR in this Parliament is 2.6%, but then it falls back to target during the course of this Parliament. And interest rates are also on a downward trajectory throughout this Parliament. We had to achieve a couple of things in the budget last week, which I was very open and honest about. We had to fill a black hole in the public finances, to put our public finances on a firmer footing. And we also had to properly fund our public services. You know, obviously, Dame Harriet, you were chair of the Select Committee in the last Parliament. There hadn't been a spending review since 2021.
On the gilt market more specifically, if I may, Chancellor, because I think there will be other questions that will come up on some of those other topics as we go through. Did you have conversations with the Debt Management Office, with the bank, about the capacity of the gilt market to absorb that extra issuance as a result of the actions that you took?
Yeah, so I regularly meet both the Debt Management Office and also the Governor of the Bank of England. I've met both since the budget and talked to them regularly. I've met the Chief Executive of the DMO since the budget. I've spoken to the Governor of the Bank of England, and the week before the budget I had the opportunity to talk the Governor through the budget when we were at the IMF annual meetings in Washington together.
And the announcement at the IMF meetings about the change to the fiscal rules that got the Speaker so upset with you, was that partly to prepare the markets for the impact of your budget? Was that following advice?
So in the election campaign and in the manifesto, we set out the 2 fiscal rules. The first to balance day-to-day spending with tax receipts, and the second to get debt down as a share of our economy. But I do take very seriously the importance of ensuring that markets understand government policy and the profile of government borrowing. So I thought it was useful ahead of the budget on advice to give some more information, but not to set out the fiscal rules ahead of the budget. It was right that we set out the measurement of those rules, also the path to meeting those rules at the budget, which is what we did.
Chair, I'll come back later if I may.
Yeah, thank you. Chris Coughlin, MP.
Thanks so much, Chancellor, for coming in, and congratulations on your appointment as well. I very much welcome the government's focus on growth, but bond markets, gilt yields rose 10 basis points on Friday. That's highly unusual outside of the mini budget, and that would indicate to me that your ability to do a similar sized fiscal event in the future is restrained. Talk about growth, and in the budget you rightly talk about the productivity crisis, and that one of the factors causing that is historically low public investment. So I was surprised to hear from the OBI yesterday that you're keeping public investment flat in the budget, despite this being one of the largest fiscal events in recent decades. So could you explain to me how you think about public investment and why it's remaining flat in the budget?
Well, thank you very much, and we haven't had the chance to meet before, and I'm very much looking forward to working with you and taking questions from you in this committee. You had evidence yesterday from Richard Hughes, and I think he noted that the gilt market response was just a response to higher volumes of gilt issuances, and he added, I would say that gilt yields are broadly in line with that expectation, maybe a little bit above, but not significantly. And Andy King stated, I think essentially the gilt market now has reacted, and it was a relatively small reaction. So I think that just in terms of putting it in perspective, the market reaction last week. In terms of whether we would be doing something similar in the future, no. This was a budget to reset, to draw a line under what the OBR described in March as the last budget, the spending plans being worse than fiction. We're drawing a line under that now. There has been a reset. It means our public finances are now on a firm footing, and the trajectory of public spending is much more honest. So we're never going to need to do a budget like this again. This was a once in a parliament reset so that we start on the right foot, and also to give businesses, families and markets confidence that we now do have our public finances on a firm footing, and set out the fiscal rules. We meet those 2 years early, and against the debt rule there's £15.7 billion of headroom in the final year. You ask about public investment. The profile that we inherited for public investment took public sector net investment from 2.5% of GDP in the current year down to 1.7% by the end of the forecast period. That would be a real terms cut of a third in public sector net investment during the course of this Parliament. That would have had, I believe, a profound impact on our growth potential as a country, and I didn't think that was a sensible path, because we've got massive opportunities as a country to invest in digital, in energy, in housing infrastructure, plus the desperate need, as we all know, to rebuild our schools and our hospitals. So we've taken public sector net investment back to that 2.5% of GDP average over the forecast period. That's £100 billion additional capital investment that wouldn't have happened under the previous government's profile.
So I fully agree with you that cutting it would be damaging, but you're keeping it flat, and if that, surely this is a missed opportunity to increase it, given that you can't do that again.
Well, so I'd just say a couple of things. We're keeping it flat as a share of GDP, so it's growing in real terms over the course of this Parliament, in line with GDP. It's £100 billion additional investment. I think that is the responsible path. There's obviously guardrails on our investment rule around how we can invest that money, but I think that is the right approach.
Sure. And just on the quality of the public investment, so many economists such as Paolo Saruca at London Business School think that mission-orientated, very specific targeted R&D is the most effective way to use public investment to crowd in private investment and help address productivity. So I was really pleased to see that in the budget, but I was very disappointed to see that you're spending 25 million on that out of 70 billion. So obviously there is a big R&D number overall, but if you could talk to me about how you think about R&D and using that as a way to boost productivity.
The R&D budget next year is £20 billion. That's a significant investment in research and development. And in the second phase of the spending review that we will set out in the spring next year, we'll be setting 10-year budgets for R&D and other capital spending to give that sort of longer-term certainty. On Friday last week, so just after the budget, I went to the Cambridge Biomedical Science Park to meet the US business, San Francisco-based business Prologis, who are investing £500 million in that science park, creating over 2,000 jobs there. And they're investing in Britain because of our commitment to R&D spending. That was something they confirmed after the budget, which I think is a real vote of confidence, both in terms of our capital spending more generally, but also our commitment to R&D in Britain. Thank you very much. Yuan Yang.
Thank you, Chair, and congratulations, Chancellor, on your historic appointment. I hope it brings more young women into our economics departments. The OBR's expectations of inflation are, of course, very much linked to its assessment that the UK economy is very close to productive potential and that there is very little slack in the labour markets and in the economy overall. Do you agree with this assessment that we're very close to our productive potential? And given the historically high levels and unusually high levels of inactivity in the labour markets, do your policies go any way towards remedying that problem? And if so, over what time period would you expect to see loosening and more productive capacity being added to the supply side of the economy?
Well, thank you very much for that question and your kind words as well. So I think that the output gap is like measurement a point in time, as you know. And it sort of comes back to the first answer that I gave to Dame Meg's question about what opportunities do I think there are to grow the economy. And we want to grow the economy through what I describe as sort of modern supply side policies to boost the productive capacity of the UK economy. Now, planning reform is a really big and important part of that, because if we can invest in infrastructure, we can improve the trend growth rate, and of course, if we do that, then the output gap widens, and there's more scope to catch up with to the potential of our economy. But there are other areas beyond planning where we can do that as well, and you've picked on the issue of our labour markets. One of the reasons why I guess we have a small output gap is because we've got a lot of people who are of working age who are not working. And that is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for those people individually, many of whom, with the right support, could work. And it's a tragedy for our country because we are losing out on growth opportunities. And, frankly, we're also paying out more in benefits than we otherwise would have to. Now, I think I announced at the budget last Wednesday that we'll shortly be publishing a white paper, which is a joint DWP, Department of Health and Department for Education white paper called Get Britain Working. And that's to address the problems, Yuan Yang, that you mention about how we can improve the supply side capacity of the economy by growing the labour market. And this is going to be a really important part of what we're trying to achieve as a government, to reduce the sickness bill, to help people of whatever age getting back to work, whether that's because of mental health, physical health. I mean, part of the reason for the £22.6 billion investment into the NHS over the next 2 years is to try and reduce those waiting lists and get more people into work. And one of the reasons why we've made that commitment around more mental health support in our schools and in our communities is to try and help more people get back to work and live the fulfilling lives that I believe that work offers. And so we'll be publishing more details in a couple of weeks' time in that white paper. But I think it's something that across all political parties we can agree that everyone who can work should work. The government has a role there by making sure that support is in place to get people back to work. But it can have a huge impact on our productive capacity as a country.
Thank you, Chancellor. And over what time frame would you expect that the OBR could revise upwards then its expectations for growth, or revise downwards its expectations of inflation? Do you think that would be what you might expect in response to your policies in health and social care and so on paying off?
That's sort of a question really for them to answer. Our job is to develop the right policies and give evidence then to the Office of Budget Responsibility about the impact that they can have on potential growth in our economy. But I'm determined to stretch all the levers, whether it's on planning, on skills, on labour markets, on the pensions reform. And I'm going to be giving my first Mansion House speech next Thursday. We're going to be talking more about the growth agenda, including around pensions, building building actually on some of the work that the previous government were doing to try and unlock that long-term patient capital for start-up and scale-up businesses. You know, the opportunities in our economy, they really are immense, but we haven't seen it in our productivity and our growth numbers in recent years. I'm determined to turn that around. That's why we've got this cross-government growth mission board. It's why growth is our number one priority. We've already been able to unlock £63.5 billion of private sector investment through our international investment summit. There's a lot more to do to drive that growth, but I feel that we are getting there, and we're pulling all of those levers.
Thank you,
Thank you
Chancellor.
very much, Johan Young. Dr. Jeevan-Sander.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to address a question to the officials, maybe to the permanent secretary to begin with. We saw that gilts fell during the Chancellor's speech, then rose afterwards. It would appear that after people had seen the OBR documents and saw the expected path of interest rates, what proportion do you think of the rising gilt yields to do with changing expectation of the bank interest rate, and what portion on other factors?
I'm absolutely not going to give a running commentary on the market movements, and that would be consistent with my predecessors and the right thing to do, because I don't know what the answer to your question is, and nor would I want to consider. But look, I'd merely echo what the Chancellor said. We've had strong auctions this year in what we've done. Those have continued after the budget. Markets are in an orderly fashion, and there's a lot of news out there at the moment. But essentially, what the budget did was set out the really important fiscal credibility and fiscal framework that we're following. It I think, put things on a long-term footing where perhaps it'd been more short-term in the past. And I think that's deeply important. I'd pull out a couple of things in that. I'd pull out the fact that we are, for the first time in a while, measuring our fiscal rules ultimately over a 3-year basis rather than a 5-year basis. And I think market participants and others had been critical that we'd said, for example, we'd deliver on our fiscal rules but never quite got to a rolling 5-year average. And I think the right thing for us to do is to set out our remit, set out our fiscal credibility, and do that. But I'm not going to get drawn into giving a running commentary on the markets, if you don't mind.
No worries.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, I just want to say congratulations on your 800-year-old glass ceiling smashing. That was absolutely brilliant, and from all of the other maths women and girls, well done. It's brilliant to have you here. So mine's a question more broadly about the impact that this budget will have on constituents like mine in Darlington. As you said, you're familiar with Darlington, but across the country, we pledged a manifesto that was going to deliver on bringing down the cost of living for working people and increasing more opportunities in our regions. So I just wanted to see what your view on the budget and the measures that you've taken this time and the impact that that'll have on people in Darlington and other constituencies.
Well, thank you very much for your question, and I get to spend now even more time in beautiful Darlington because of the economic campus that we have there. And as I said in answer to an earlier question, the Growth Mission Board will be meeting there later this month. And it is fantastic that we've got civil servants who otherwise I don't think would enter the civil service because of that campus. And that means that we can have a more diverse range of civil servants bringing perspectives from all around the country. And I think that is really welcome in economic policy making and in policy making more widely. If you look at the measures in the EFO, the OBR forecast around living standards, there's some very positive news. First of all, real household disposable income, probably the key metric for living standards, increases by an average of 0.5% a year during the forecast period. And obviously that compares to sort of pretty stagnant living standards in the previous parliament, the worst parliament on record for living standards. If you look at other measures, wage growth is forecast to rise during the course of this parliament, and indeed GDP per capita, which had been on a downward path, is forecast to rise in this parliament by the Office for Budget Responsibility. If you look at some of the sort of specific measures that we are taking, the increase in the national living wage by I think 6.7%, taking it to £12.21 an hour, also increasing the 18 to 21-year-old rate of the national minimum wage to £10 an hour, obviously have a big impact, particularly at the lower wage part of the labour market, and that has a particular effect of women in the labour market, because sadly 54 years after the Equal Pay Act, it's still the case that women on average earn something like 14% less than men, and women are more concentrated in those very lowest paid minimum wage and living wage jobs. So that has a particular impact, the increase in the national living wage and the national minimum wage on female workers. There's also some specific action we're taking, for example, around carers allowance, increasing how much you can earn before you lose your carers allowance. That's something that many parties spoke about, but particularly the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton during the election campaign, that people worked extra hours as carers and then lost all of their carers allowance, and we've now increased the what you can earn on a weekly basis before you lose your carers allowance. I think it's the biggest increase in how much you can earn on carers allowance since 1976. And again, that is predominantly lower paid and often women workers who benefit most from that change. And also some of the changes we've made around universal credit deductions are really important for lower paid workers. So it was previously the case that if you'd got into debt with the Department for Work and Pensions, 25% of your universal credit payment could be deducted. We've reduced that to 15%. That's worth, I think, up to £420 a year for families affected. And the impact on child poverty, particular family poverty, but particularly child poverty, could be really big. And so those are just some of the measures we're taking to try and address the cost of living crisis for families.
Thank you. The only thing I wanted to follow up on that, so obviously you mentioned women in the labour market, and I know that Yuan Yang mentioned about getting people back to work. We know that a lot of women are forced out of work for childcare and for also because of the SEND crisis is actually forcing a lot of mums to stay home. I wondered what sort of time frame you might expect to see some of these people back in the labour market from the measures that we're taking.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question as well. There is a section in our document, the autumn budget document, about women in the economy, which I'm really pleased about. I'm not going to find it. About the impact that our policies are having in terms of women in the economy. And look, it is still the case that women still do the majority of childcare in our country, and so measures around childcare do have a particular impact on women in the labour market. We've increased by £1.8 billion the amount we're spending on childcare, taking that to £8 billion to try and improve both the quality and the availability of childcare, to give children a really good start in life, but also to give parents and particularly mums a chance to get back into work. But also a commitment to roll out breakfast clubs at primary schools. That's going to be something that we're rolling out to all primary schools from the next academic year, but we want to get started on this because we know what a big impact it can have, both in terms of children's development, but also the ability of parents, particularly mums, to work some extra hours every week. And we've put more support, almost £1 billion, into special educational needs, which I think the Prime Minister said it today at Prime Minister's Questions. It's the fifth Prime Minister's Questions in a row where a backbench MP has raised the issue of special educational needs from all political parties. We all know from our postbags as MPs how much parents struggle with support for some of the most vulnerable children. And obviously that additional money will make a massive difference to the lives of those children, but also we know it will make a massive difference to their parents as well, because the biggest stress as a parent is when your child is struggling at school, and if you know your child has got that extra support, that enables you to continue working as well. And we know otherwise a lot of kids with special educational needs drop out of school. That's a huge loss for them, but it also has impacts on their parents too.
Thank you very
Can
much.
I just ask about how the Treasury will be evaluating the impact of these in economic terms? So when Parliament's looked at childcare for example, evaluating whether it's actually getting parents back into work is something that sometimes can be missing. Is this something that you're making? I'm presumably the Chief Secretary will be partly responsible for this, but is this something you're writing in? Because you can sit here and make these promises, people on the ground want to see them, you want to see people into work, they want to see themselves in work, but are you going to actually make sure that the money is going to deliver that outcome? Mr. Smewing?
Yeah.
Well, so just pick that up. So obviously when the expansion of childcare was initially announced, there was a lot of analysis and work that went on with the OBR to make some assessments about what the impact of that would be. But to your point, the crucial thing is to have a proper impact evaluation of what is actually happening to that. That's going to be central to the DfE's rollout of that policy, and there are a number of ways that they'll look at evaluating that. It will take some time, obviously, for us to kind of gather a really robust evaluation. But as with all of these public policy interventions that we're doing, the sort of cycle of evaluation and then testing and then re-evaluating is going to be something that we will carry on following through.
And then the other area that I think Ms Young wants to come in on as well is about the health money that's going in. A lot of money going in over the next 2 years into health. We know from bitter experience money can be poured into the health service and not always deliver exactly what's required. And the OBR had warned just a degree of scepticism about whether the health money would actually focus on those who could get back into employment, because of obviously health priorities coming first. The money could, for instance, on hips and knees replacements, for example, could be focused on people who were never really going to get back into the workplace for other reasons, age particularly. So how are you going to make sure that that investment is actually delivering on your workforce plans?
Well, it wouldn't be right for the NHS to prioritise people based on whether they are in work or able to get back to work. But we have had commitment from the NHS that the money that we made available in the budget last week will enable us to meet our commitment of 40,000 additional appointments every single week in the NHS, taking us to those 2 million additional appointments a year. And the 40,000 a week will be able, because of the investment that we made last week, be able to achieve that in the first year of this government.
The first year up to end of March, or first
the first year of this government, so
to
July, that we'll be able to deliver those 40,000 additional appointments a week by then. And as I said in the answer to, I think, the question from Yuan Yang, we're going to be publishing in the next couple of weeks the Get Britain Working white paper.
We expect to see more detail there.
Yeah, and I think look, one of the things that I'm really pleased about with this white paper is that it's not just a DWP white paper, that it's something that we've worked across government. And this is the sort of value of these mission boards, really, because it does encourage that sort of cross team working, which has always been a criticism of government, that it works in silos, and we're trying to break out of that.
The Holy Grail.
We're only four months in, so I'll just get an idea how it's going. But I think it is really important, because to get people back to work, that can't be something that DWP is going to achieve
But the
alone.
health money will be, it's going to be a challenge. As you say, quite rightly, you can't instruct the NHS just to spend the money on people who might get back into work. So do you have any metric, or will you be developing a metric through this new the white paper that's coming out about how you're going to measure the impact of that money on employment?
I'm very happy after the white paper's published to come back and answer more questions, and I'm sure that the Work and Pensions Secretary would be happy to do that with the relevant Select Committee as well. But I think it's a really important point, because we all know that you can't just sort of spend your way to better public services. We've got to run them better as well. There has been a collapse in productivity in the health service since the pandemic, and we need to improve that. I think there are lots of reasons behind that. I think morale in the health service has been very low. There has been a problem with a lack of capital investment in public services in general, but particularly in the health service. I was at St George's Hospital in Tooting just last week ahead of the budget, and staff there were telling me that they're still using scanners and diagnostic equipment that was bought under the last Labour government, so 15 years ago, that should have been written off and obsolete by now, but they haven't had the investment to be able to update that equipment. And also the statistics about the number of wards and the number of beds on any given day that can't be used because of poor conditions in NHS settings. So we do need to improve those things. It's why
you're saying capital investment and the 22 billion.
So the £22.6 billion is day-to-day spending, but we've also announced £3.1 billion additional capital investment next year in the health service, and that is really important because unless you're working with modern diagnostic equipment and you've got NHS settings able to provide healthcare, you're not going to get value for money. That's not the whole solution. I think using digital much more rather than analogue.
Dangerous sounding like the health secretary.
But I expect all of us, all of us who use the NHS would have had in the last couple of months, either ourselves or our children, a letter that comes through the post from the NHS. I think they've probably got our emails. We need to make sure we're improving the use of technology to reduce costs and indeed to improve service to patients.
I would just say that some of us around the table have seen money going into the NHS, and I'm sure the Treasurer will be watching it very closely. Maybe Mr McFarlane can enlighten us on this, and I'm going to bring in two colleagues.
It was less specific to health, Chair, if I may, though, linking a few of the questions from the committee about implementation, follow through, when will these things sort of impact. I mean, not only Mr Smewing's point about evaluation, Mr Glenn asked about the mission board. The Chancellor has established the Growth Delivery Unit in the Treasury, specifically focused on these sorts of announcements and how they are followed through the system, and that will be kind of reporting in real time in how these things are being followed through, linked to the growth mission, but very much the announcements in each budget, and how they will then be delivered.
We may have that team in front of this committee.
And indeed, one fiscal event a year to mean that we're not just in constant policy development, we're actually in delivery mode.
You look almost relieved, Permanent Secretary.
Praise.
One way of getting your Permanent Secretary on side, Chancellor, reduce their workload. I was going to bring in, I think you and Yang had a very quick point, and then Mr Glenn.
Very briefly, Chancellor, just to go back to the question of timeframes. When you look at the scale of the problem of the post-pandemic scarring of the labour markets, do you see this as a kind of 1-2 year problem? Is it a 5-year problem, or will it take longer than that to really start to heal?
I mean, there's no time to waste. We're publishing the white paper because we know how important it is. We've been working at it over the summer and into the autumn. I think it'd be better for me to come back once that is published to give more evidence on that. But it is, as you can see, a really crucial part of our growth agenda.
I think, Chancellor, you're one of an early witness who's keen to come back regularly from the number of options you're giving us. So we may well.
No, I had a choice.
Indeed, you don't. But I'm putting it politely as your first time appearance. So.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. John Glenn.
Yes. Could I ask Mr McFarlane about the mechanisms for accountability for expenditure? I mean, I recall numerous times where, in the run-up to any fiscal event, there was another call on extra resources for the NHS, probably absolutely necessary, but there was never a mechanism to assess the productivity of that investment and to hold people accountable for it, be it other ministers or have a transparent mechanism that would allow you in the Treasury to say, right, we put this money in, we got these outcomes. And I think in particular with health, and I recognise what the Chancellor said and what the government's trying to do in terms of the backlog, but there is of course a danger that the backlog principally from the COVID experience will be cleared, but there won't be clarity on where money is spent efficiently going forward. Do you have any thoughts on how in the constant process of iteration, you can create structures that actually bring that accountability.
I may on this one, but defer to Mr. Smearing, Mr. Glenn, if that's right.
As a former Chief Secretary.
That's right. So it's obviously a very, very important question. I'd distinguish two different kinds of things. One of them is sort of impact evaluation of new policy initiatives, which I talked about a minute ago. The other one is like performance measurement and tracking the performance of of public services as the money is going in or as investment is taking place, tracking the efficiency and the productivity of those things. The government does have, as I think you'll probably know, the sort of government efficiency framework, which is a good way of conceptualising the kinds of questions of interaction between input, output and outcome that you have in monitoring public services. I do think that in phase 2 of the spending review we'll want to be refreshing that performance framework really in particular in a world where we are looking at missions which are bringing in a broader number of areas of public spending which all impact on the same outcome. Like thinking through how you can properly measure and track how the policies that we're implementing are having impact on that, I think is a really important thing for the next spending review. So I guess that would be.
Does that mean that you will require bids in the spending review? Well, maybe it's for the Chief Secretary, but I guess Mr. Smearing here in his place in the sense that they will have to add evaluation into every project.
It's been in the case in previous spending reviews, and I think we will do the same in this spending review. That particularly for kind of new initiatives, it's important to build in the evaluation from the beginning and have a robust evaluation.
It's a rounding error, isn't it? It's a cost to pay for an evaluation. So that's going to be absolute requirement. Won't get across the line for us in the spending review unless that's robustly included.
I think it's going to be a requirement in any set of spending review guidance that people set out how they would evaluate the spending they do.
One little bit of me lives in hopes that it will actually deliver. The cynic in me, after a decade, says it still might be challenging, but at least that's an important step. Thank you.
Just on that one very quickly.
Very, very good. If it's one sentence, it's Dr. Sanders' wasted.
Smearing, sorry, forgive my ignorance. So were there not effective evaluation matrices in before this government came in?
So there has long been a set of frameworks which are place requirements around producing evaluation of public policy impact. I think as the sort of chair was indicating, it's not always the case that those frameworks are sort of followed to the letter, and I think there's a very important role for the Treasury in providing the kind of demand signal for robust evaluation to the sort of broader public sector, both by setting out the kinds of requirements that the chair was referring to, but also taking that evidence and using it and responding so that if the best impact evaluation evidence suggests that this policy is working and this one is not, you shift resources across.
Yeah, so it doesn't just go into a filing cabinet after the meeting.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Challenges taking the projects away from people, but yes, Permanent Secretary.
I mean, the only thing I'd be very, very keen for this committee to be supportive of is, as we go forward, as we go forward and we try and change the way we do things for the better by learning what works and what doesn't work, then you need to change things. You need to stop some things.
Exactly.
As you start some other things, you need to do the things that work more and the things that don't work less. And, that just absolutely has to be at the front of a reform agenda going forward, not least because, it isn't the case that additional money is going to be the answer to all of these things. Have you heard me say that before?
Indeed, and I think many governments are challenged to say no to things, but we have the Iron Chancellor. Is that what you're called nowadays, Chancellor?
One of the things that we're going to be doing...
has no in her lexicon, I think.
One of the things that we're going to be doing, Chair, is a zero-based review for every department as part of the next phase of the spending review, which I think is really important. Obviously, we did phase 1 of the spending review last week alongside the budget. And to be honest, that was quite a quick spending review, and it had to be because we didn't have any spending allocations beyond next March. And so we had to get that done this autumn to give departments a chance to prepare for the next fiscal year. But I think we could do better in phase 2 because we've got longer to do it. We'll be kicking that spending review off shortly. But that spending review will be much more bottom-up with the zero-based review to do exactly what the Permanent Secretary has spoken about, to get that prioritisation.
Is that a warning that some things may be cut and dropped?
Well, and so they should be. If things are not priorities and other things are greater priorities, we should put more resource and more time and effort into things that are priorities. But that requires difficult decisions, because obviously there will always be understandably vested interests to defend the things that already
You're saying you're not
exist.
going to take on vested interests among colleagues in the Cabinet?
Well, I think we absolutely have to be, but also these things have got to be led by departments. They shouldn't be led by the Treasury. If a department does a zero-based review and has a hierarchy of the importance of things, then surely you'd rather get rid of some things at the bottom of your list to be able to do more of the things at the top of the list. And you can't start doing new things when you've now set the spending envelope unless you stop doing things that are less of a priority.
Very clear. Thank you very much. Dr. Cheevan-Sander.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chancellor. I want to associate myself with the remarks of other people and the committee of being the first female Chancellor. I know how much it meant for the British Indian community to see a previous Chancellor stand up. I'm sure many young women and girls felt the same as you gave your first ever budget. I want to ask specifically around long-term investment and growth out of your budget. You set out Securenomics as your economic philosophy about secure foundations you need. Can you set out in this budget how it began to build long-term secure growth for the United Kingdom?
Well, thank you very much for your question. So Securenomics is about building strong growth on stable foundations. I guess the most important thing there is bringing back economic stability, because we know that a lack of certainty about the path of economic policy creates that sort of instability that inhibits investment. But also part of Securenomics is about ensuring that the economic growth, that our economy is more resilient to shocks. And I think we can all agree that the last few years has been full of economic shocks. And the problem is, when those shocks come along, how resilient is your economy to withstanding them? And I think during the sort of the global pandemic, we found ourselves very reliant on supply chain, very long and complicated supply chains, and found that we were very short of essentials. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we found that although we had invested in renewables, we were still very, very reliant on oil and gas from overseas and to those global markets. And the idea of Securenomics is about trying to build more resilience into the economy. I guess the sort of best example would be around what we're trying to do on energy policy. Now, there's a number of things we're trying to achieve. We're trying to reduce people's energy bills. We're trying to bring more good jobs, because it is obviously a massive growth industry. And it was interesting when we did the International Investment Summit and we got that £63.5 billion worth of investment. Such a large part of it was in low carbon, zero carbon energy. That shows that it's not just a priority for this government, but it's a real investment opportunity and priority for international investors. And then the sort of third part of that our energy policy is about ensuring greater energy security, so we are less reliant on other countries around the world for our basic energy needs. So I think that's sort of the best example I can give you about what Securenomics means in practice. It's about building a stronger and more resilient economy in face of the shocks that we all face.
Yeah, and thinking forward to future fiscal events, a more secure economy is very good. I want to associate the Chair's remarks about how what gets measured gets done. How can we ensure this kind of measures to increase security, including future forecasts? You've mentioned energy, for example. There will be others. This will be about limiting the downside risk to GDP. My concern is it's not going to be inside future growth forecasts, but that builds more secure foundations. Will you consider kind of building those into future forecasts, and maybe the officials also might want to feed in at that point?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the really important innovations with the Office of Budget Responsibility is these longer term forecasts. I think that is just so important to try and foster not just for this government, but future governments as well, a longer term approach when it comes to policy making. It's no good just to do things that will, speed up a bit of growth for the next few years. We need to be making those long term decisions in the national interest, and that's the purpose of having those longer term forecasts. But also, and I guess it sort of comes back to John Glenn's question earlier about what GDP target are we chasing? I do think it is important that we look at how we perform compared to similar countries, because the shocks that we face do tend to be global in nature, and I think that's something that will continue in the years and decades to come. It's about how strong and resilient are we in the face of those shocks, and Securenomics is about trying to ensure when the next shock comes along that we have done more to build, for example, those more robust supply chains, etc. I just like coming back on the question that John Glenn as well was asking about at the beginning about the United States. One thing about Securenomics is about caring about where things are made and who makes them and who owns them. I don't think that's about being protectionist. It's about being a realist in economic policy making. I'm not in favour of of new tariffs against countries, but I am in favour of trying to do things more with countries that share our values and building, for example, critical mineral supply chains across countries. The Five Eyes, for example, who have that collaboration in the sort of defence space. Also think about how we can use that in the economic space as well. And I think that as the sort of nature of the sort of global shocks and alliances are changing, we should be mindful of that when it comes to economic policy making as well.
Very helpful. I think one final question, if I may, on global shocks. You have written in your, I think it's your May's lecture, or you said in your May's lecture, that the growth model built upon geopolitical stability is resting on shallow foundations, and clearly this is a far more unstable world. I don't expect you to have like a fully formed out answer to this question, but there is a debt crisis in Africa at the moment, 32 of those nations spending more on debt repayments and health. That's going to have impacts there, but also impacts on our growth here at home. Will you consider kind of measures to address it, specifically given the amount of private creditors that hold that debt within the UK?
A brief answer, I think, on this. If that can.
Yes. I was just going to make a joke at my own expense, actually. So the May's lecture was the longest speech I ever gave until I delivered my budget. Just on this issue around African debt and the debt crisis, I think as one of the largest providers of official development assistance across the G7, I do think we are playing our part in pressing for steps to avoid a new African debt crisis, supporting vulnerable countries where debt repayments are crowding out investment in tackling poverty and indeed in tackling the climate emergency. We're an active participant in the G20's Common Framework Initiative to assist developing countries with repayment problems. We've already supported Chad, Ethiopia and Zambia, but we know that the current process is too slow, so we're pushing for a more timely coordination amongst international partners.
Can I just pick up on one point that came up with Mr. Glenn and Dr. Sander? You said that the UK is not a passive actor in a relationship with the US. You also said you don't want to see it put tariffs up unnecessarily. But would you retaliate if the tariffs were imposed on the UK?
We're not in that world, and I'm not going to speculate.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucy Rigby.
Thank you, Chair. And Chancellor, I want to add my kind words to all of the other kind words this afternoon. I would add, I know that you're keen to go to Darlington, but in 1205, the Treasury, King John moved it to Northampton. Just for you to bear in mind. Yeah. So, Chancellor, I wanted to just to follow on the investment piece, the public investment piece. The OBR assumes certain time lags when it comes to the benefits of public investment. Do you have a view on the duration of those time lags? I'm conscious that you said right at the start of this session that you want growth to come through faster, but is the government intending to do anything to try and ensure that those benefits of public investment are felt as soon as possible?
Yeah, so there are sort of two types of capital investment that were prioritised in the budget last week. The first part was those things where we can really crowd in private investment and look to grow our economy and seize some of those huge opportunities. I think probably the best example of that was what we've done around carbon capture and storage in Merseyside and Teesside, where £21 billion over 25 years of public investment is crowding in now £8 billion of private investment, and of course that will unlock more investment in the years to come, creating I think 4,000 direct jobs and securing something like 40,000 jobs in the wider energy intensive industries. That's something that's only possible because of the change in our fiscal rules to unlock, as I said in my answer to Chris Coughlin's question earlier, the £100 billion of additional capital investment during the course of this Parliament. But there are other examples in the budget of growth enhancing, directly growth enhancing investments that crowd in private investment. And indeed, the National Wealth Fund that we've capitalised, that will crowd in tens of billions of pounds of private investment. And we worked really closely with Mark Carney, but also with Venkat from Barclays, Amanda Blank from with Venkat, with L&G, Antonio at L&G and others, to develop the National Wealth Fund in a way that does crowd in that private money, which is really important. So that was part of what we were doing on the capital side, and the other part of what we're doing on the capital side is renewing the fabric of our public infrastructure. So particularly the investment in the NHS capital, particularly around diagnostic equipment, but also the 500 new schools that we've committed to refurbish during the course of this Parliament. So sort of two types of capital investment. And in terms of the benefits being felt, the first benefit, I guess, is like through the process of building, creating good jobs, paying decent wages. And the second is with that new capital comes new opportunities, whether you're a patient in the health service, a child at a school, or indeed whether you are working in ceramics or glass making or steel, that benefits once carbon capture and storage is at scale and up and running. One of the things, though, and this sort of goes back to the sort of the fiscal rules that that I set out in the budget last week, separating out capital spending from day-to-day spending. I think in terms of the sort of long-term impact of this budget, this is more important than anything else, because under the previous government, capital and day-to-day spending were treated the same in terms of the fiscal rule. The rule was the 3% deficit, 3%, and it doesn't matter whether it's capital or day-to-day spending. We've said that we will balance day-to-day spending with tax receipts. That is a really tough fiscal rule. It wasn't one being met by the previous government. We are determined to meet it, and the OBR say we're going to meet it 2 years early in the third year of the forecast period. But then a combination of that and the investment rule that says you can only borrow to invest but get debt down in the fifth year, moving to the third year of the forecast. And that's what unlocks this £100 billion. But also what this rule stops you from doing, which has been, I think, a big mistake in the past, is shift money from capital to day-to-day to plug gaps in day-to-day spending. And the problem with doing that is you're always just putting off difficult decisions, and you are making every budget and every spending review harder than the last one because you haven't made those capital investments to improve the productivity and the efficiency
I think we're
of
well
our public
worn
services.
on those arguments on this committee.
And Chair, if I might follow up, so I'm conscious, Chancellor, you've changed your the debt metric to net financial liabilities. Can you just tell us a little bit about why you think that's the most appropriate measure relative to the prior measure, but also perhaps relative to public sector net worth?
So look, there is sort of a whole spectrum of acronyms to choose.
We've decided to spell it out in full.
From very user-friendly.
Snuffles.
Look, public sector net worth would have created even more space. But I think public sector net financial liabilities is a target that is already measured. It has been measured since 2016 by the Office of National Statistics, and it's something that's been forecast by the Office of Budget Responsibility as well since 2016. So it is I wouldn't quite go as far as saying well known, but it is something that is out there, measured and forecast already. It's not something that we are just introducing from scratch. So it's got some sort of pedigree. it is a broader measure because it takes into account the benefits of investment, not just the costs, and looks at the whole balance sheet of financial assets on the government's balance sheet. So I think it is a wider but a more honest measure of the government's liabilities than the previous PSND measure. So we thought that it was an appropriate measure of the debt to target, and of course we are targeting to bring that down as a share of our economy.
And just to follow up on that, Chancellor, I'm conscious you've also got your financial transaction control framework. That, as I understand it, is intended to ensure that you provide value for money. Can you just explain a little bit about how value for money is going to be ensured via that framework?
Yes, so there's a number of what we call guardrails around the investment rule, getting investment, public sector net financial liabilities, public sector net debt for short, down as a share of GDP. So first of those guardrails is strengthening the role of institutions to improve infrastructure delivery, which I know is something that the Chair has spoken about on a number of occasions with the creation of the new National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority. So that's about ensuring that we improve infrastructure delivery to get better value for money. The next is about ensuring greater transparency and oversight, and so the National Audit Office will do annual audits of government's investment through CDEL. The next is all large-scale financial transactions and guarantees would be delivered by expert institutions, arm's length, independent from government, through the National Wealth Fund, UK Export Finance and the British Business Bank. So it's not government, it's not me or the Chief Secretary deciding on the investments, it is those independent bodies. And then alongside that, we've got the updated Charter for Budget Responsibility, and that sets out responsible and some of the common sense reforms to the fiscal framework. So as the Permanent Secretary said, moving to one fiscal event a year, committing to hold a spending review every 2 years, setting minimum budgets of 3 years to avoid cliff edges, but crucially setting 5-year capital budgets that will be updated every 2 years. Because one of the things that people say to me time and time again, what adds costs to infrastructure investment and any big investments is a constant changing of the priorities. And so setting those long-term budgets, I think, is really essential for getting better value for money for government investment.
Just to add, Chair, to the Chancellor's explanation of the move to net financial debt, I mean, that has enabled, as the Chancellor explained to Mr Coughlin, to move immediately back to sort of 2.5% of GDP spent on public sector net investment and sustain that over the Parliament. And Ms Rigby, you asked about the time lags that the Office for Budget Responsibility have talked about. I mean, I think in their analysis, they have explained those time lags, but that's why it's so important. They have also done this longer term analysis of sustaining that level of public sector net investment, being unambiguous, the whole budget package being therefore unambiguously positive for GDP within 10 years, and as the Chancellor spoke about at the start of the session, this 1.4% benefit to GDP from this higher sustained level of public sector net investment over the long term. And that's really important, their new analysis that they've provided, despite the time lags.
Yeah, I mean, Chair, that's...
Mr Coughlin, and now
just come very quickly, Mr McFarlane, that 2.5%, how... Well, I shouldn't know this off the top of my head, but how does that compare to other countries with better productivity performance than us? As in, what would be a healthy level, an optimal level of public sector investment for us, say, versus Germany or France?
Mr Smearing?
At the moment, we're the only G20 economy with investment, public and private, of less than 20% of GDP. And the way that we are structuring our capital spending, particularly through the National Wealth Fund, is about crowding in private investment. So you should see the two together. And that's why what Will McFarlane was saying is really important, that what the OBR forecast, and this is chart 3.3 in their EFO, it's about crowding in the private investment, which is really, really crucial as part of what we're trying to achieve.
you.
I was just going to jump in
Mr.
with
Smearing.
not the international comparison, but the historical comparison. So that 2.6 compares to an average between 1997 and 2023 of below 2%, maybe about 1.8% of GDP. So it is significantly higher than public investment has been sustained in the UK over the last 30 years or so.
Okay. One of the challenges about the new debt measure is that it could incentivise loans, being more loans in policy than grants. Is that something that you care about? What are you doing to guard against it? Does it, how does it matter? Who wants to take that? Mr. Smewing?
Right. So I think the first thing I'd say on that is that is a feature, not a bug. So
that's very clever.
if you have two policies which can both support a particular public policy thing, and one of them returns cash to the public sector in future and the other one doesn't, you should have some fiscal rules which take account of that. And so that is a sensible thing to do. What I do think is important to emphasise, as the Chancellor was saying earlier, are the guardrails around the quality of the loans that you are making. I'd say two things on that. The first is we're maintaining the Treasury's control framework on other departments on financial transactions, so that will all still be considered in the spending review. If those are loss-making transactions, they'll impact on their resource budget. So that will all still be in place. As the Chancellor was saying, having expert independent bodies in the centre, like the National Wealth Fund, who can make those sorts of loans and are being properly audited and are reporting transparently on how those loans are performing, is a really important guardrail.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Glenn, and then I might come back.
Could I ask the Permanent Secretary, Mr. Bowler, about the interaction with the OBR and whether anything changed in the interaction with the OBR between Treasury officials and OBR officials in the run-up to the March fiscal event? Was it any different to anything previously?
So the thing that changed is that we found out that the way we were forecasting debt in the coming year didn't work, and the way we found that out was that previously, through the OBR's existence, we had taken a top-down approach to forecasting DEL. So we essentially gave the OBR a number. We didn't do a bottom-up approach, so we didn't do the sum of all of its parts. So we treated DEL slightly differently. DEL was controlled by is a decision of the control of the government, unlike tax, unlike AMI. So we did it differently. That had worked, as I think you heard evidence on yesterday, perfectly well in previous years, but it meant that there was a built-in assumption that if you did have pressures in year, those would be offset either by offsetting savings or by underspends. And what we found out was that was not the case in 2004-05. Neither of those things materialised. Both in February, where the OBR recorded, and as the evidence we gave them, that there was a £9.5 billion pressure, and then throughout 2004-05, where we've published a document that sets this out perfectly clearly, that where we were in the budget, 16 billion, and then ultimately by July at 22 billion. So those pressures grew, and the offsetting savings didn't follow, and that is why we've changed our framework, and that's why we said in July we needed to change our framework, and that's why the OBR did their review. They came up with their recommendations. Chancellor and ourselves have accepted them. I would like to take, if I may, an opportunity at this point to clear up something that did come up yesterday in your evidence, which is quite important to me. So there was a question about whether we acted within the law in this thing, and it's important to me to point out that I think we're clear that the Treasury did act within the law. Indeed, it's because the law is more about what the OBR have the right to ask for rather than what is provided to them of our own initiative that we've needed to strengthen the framework as we are. But I hope I've set out what happened there. I think the evidence you got yesterday was that the way we did things worked for the process of up to 2004-05, but it didn't work for 2004-05. And one defining...
24-25, yeah.
I'm so sorry, thank you. So many numbers. And I think the one defining feature of that year is that it was the last year of the spending review. So we'd had the spending review set in 2021. This was now 3 years on. It was that last year. We hadn't had another spending review. If we'd had another spending review, we'd have reset that year as you do. And a really important improvement in our fiscal framework is we will now have spending reviews every 2 years. So that last year always gets reset to try and avoid this pressure, this idea of things getting unstuck. And
Mr. Bowler, a number of us around this table have been watching public spending, including some of you on that table, for a long time. There was always an awareness there were great pressures in the system. Lots of things were delayed, put off for spending, promised but spending later, commitments that hadn't been quite crystallised, so therefore couldn't actually be budgeted against, but were liabilities coming up, other contingent liabilities. So it does seem extraordinary that this is a major material aspect wasn't picked up. It's fair that the OBR wouldn't know to ask for it. I think we kind of established that with them yesterday. Did it not occur to anyone in the Treasury that this was something that should have perhaps been flagged with the OBR more proactively?
Yeah, look, I totally recognise that. I was trying to explain the difference between the top-down approach we'd had before and the bottom-up approach we're going to have now. And,
no, but to be fair, we've had some very good directors of public spending and teams who are closely watching. In fact, departments sometimes complain how closely the Treasury is watching their spending. So did the Treasury take its eye off the ball because it was the late stage of the third year of the spending review period? Or why weren't these pressures being coming up through the system?
So the particular focus of the OBR was in, when they were asked these questions, in February. So that was before the year had started. And we're certainly aware of the issues there. We've published this document that sets all of that out in detail because we want to be very transparent about all of this. It was the case that in previous years, pressures had been managed down either by active steps, increasing in budget or reductions, or by underspends coming through. And it became very apparent that was not the case as we went into that year. Indeed, the pressures rose, and we document that in this document. And there's a chart in the budget. Far from departments underspending as they had pretty much consistently for the decade or so before, departments were spending was running ahead of forecast rather than below, and we set that out in the document. So both of those things were happening. And
but you've got accounting officers in every department with the extra complication of an election looming, so they knew it was going to be coming in the financial year, and in the end it came. Parliament dissolved. I suppose government carried on. Parliament dissolved in April. April, right? May. It was May. I'm running ahead of myself. So were all those accounting officers just missing something? I mean, the fact that there weren't the underspends, the fact that they weren't keeping an eye on the budget.
Normally these pressures would just come up. No, not at all. So we're in constant contact with departments all the way through this, and the discussions going into at that time was a combination of pressures rising and what offsetting savings they could have, and it's in the document, but perhaps Mr. Smearing can clarify it. There's then the question of what's recorded at main estimates and what's recorded at supplementary estimates coming through in there. And as I think you've had, if not in your last committee, people like colleagues like the Home Office, where very significant asylum pressure was coming through and growing, where the decision taken by ministers was to look at that into supplementary estimates later in the year rather than and work through it on that timescale. But Conrad, do you want to say?
Yeah, all I'd add. So accounting officers were obviously aware of these pressures, and they were communicating them to the Treasury, and that exchange of information is one of the things which underlines the assessment of gross pressures, which is in the response to the OBR review that we've published. So the $9.5 billion that was mentioned at the time of the February challenge panel, and then rising to 16 billion by the time of the budget, and then rising to 22 billion by July. So accounting officers were already in discussion with the Treasury about how those pressures would be either managed or further funding would be provided. In a number of cases, the previous practice, for example, in the asylum system, had been, because of the uncertainty of the pressure, to deal with that at supplementary estimates.
So February of
yes,
25.
exactly, coming up in in January, February 2025. And that's the basis on which they were proceeding. So I think, the sort of, to come back to the main...
That's a significant amount for a supplementary estimate.
It
more
is
than normal.
That's absolutely the case, and I think John Glenn started by asking what had changed, what was different this year. The size of the pressures and the fact, as the Permanent Secretary was saying, that offsetting changes to reduce those pressures did not start happening in the way that would have happened in the past, is the driver of the larger estimate.
I don't want this to be an act of self-justification because I wasn't there earlier this year, but from the 12th up till the 12th of November last year, I was familiar with an ongoing process of Chief Secretary Chief Secretary of having pressures that one was carrying, and indeed numerous meetings were held, and it was a question of budgets that were there that we didn't know whether they would be spent or not. And I think it's very unfortunate we've got in a situation where the OBR and Treasury are deemed to have sort of been politicised through this. And I just want to get to the core of this, because ongoing pressures that a government has to manage never crystallise until a fiscal event when decisions are made. And unfortunately, what I'm concerned about is that it was convenient to characterise that the Chancellor's predecessor had made a choice to obfuscate and hide pressures. Now, I think what you've said today is that wasn't the case, that the unseasonal level of inflation and the costs going through the year meant that there was going to be a very tough spending review, rollover spending review, which is essentially was going to happen in all circumstances. But we were only 7 weeks into the fiscal year when the government left office on the 24th of May, essentially. What I'm trying to get at is that this characterisation of the previous government carrying a 22 billion black hole is at odds with the documents that were produced in good faith by all parties, chancellors and officials at the previous budget. And indeed, subsequently, the OBR's breakdown of that 22 billion demonstrates that it wasn't 22 billion. There were ongoing pressures, but it amounted to 9.5 billion, and there were further choices between the election and this budget. So, we have got to, I'm anxious to avoid a situation for the good of this country that the OBR and the Treasury aren't put into this position again. And I want reassurance that we are in that position now.
Mr. Bowler.
Yeah, so look, there's a lot there. Let's go in reverse order. Will we be putting this in position again? No, because we've made the changes to make sure that won't happen.
Can I just say, it's still not clear to me, really, why you were in this position.
Yeah.
The last year of a spending review isn't an excuse.
No. I did try. I did try. So will we put this position again? No, because we've made sure that is the case, and that is about doing bottom-up forecasting of Dell rather than just top-down a single number, and a much bigger share of information. And there are 10 recommendations we've accepted. Yeah. Was it business as usual in there? No, it wasn't. And it's worth saying several things there, but the document that we've published that maps this all out, I think, sets it out most clearly. And the thing to say, as the OBR have said, and I don't think the OBR and ourselves are at odds on this, by the way. I don't revile from the OBR's review, and I don't think we disagree. The OBR, the number of pressure was high, very high, in February at that level, at 9 billion. And what I've tried to set out is you would expect through offsetting savings, decisions taken by ministers to reduce that pressure, and you would expect underspends to come in, and we'd had a long history of departments to underspend. So those two things to bring that number, that did not happen. So those pressures rose, and you can see...
That wouldn't have happened routinely outside of the preparation for a fiscal event. It was just, that was what the business a
Well,
chief
you'd
secretary
expect-
and a chancellor
Yeah,
would
you'd
do.
expect that to happen then. But I wouldn't characterise it as business as usual. And that's why we've made the changes we've had, which are, important. I don't, the issue of the legal issue, which is important to me. What I think we're seeing here is I don't think we're disagreeing with the OBR at all. We had very sensible conversations with the OBR through this. What we're seeing is the OBR framework evolving and strengthening to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
It's always all right after the event. I'll just say that the memorandum of understanding, though, between the Treasury or the government and the OBR is that government departments will proactively provide relevant information to the OBR. Do you think that they met that? Or you met that?
Look, absolutely, I think it would be the case, as that. Hence why we've changed the framework, that we've done things differently for this last year, given what we know. So yes, I mean that's why we've changed the framework.
Chancellor.
Thank you very much, Chair. When I arrived at the Treasury that first weekend, it was made really clear to me that the starting point for my inheritance was not the forecast in the budget from March, and that the actual spending that was happening was significantly higher than that. And you can see that in the monthly public sector finance figures, because in the first 6 months of the year, they're running at £11 billion higher than the OBR were forecasting back in March. And that was already the case.
Just outline what you think the pressures that were put to you were, what the spending.
Well, we have
We've heard
published
some
now
examples,
the line-by-line breakdown of it, but two of the biggest components of it was a £6.4 billion unfinanced pressure in asylum. And this wasn't just a pressure, this was something that was being paid for every month with no plan to bring it down. In fact, it was rising. And the second was...
that was known, that was a big pressure before.
It wasn't known going into the election. It was something that was given to me when I became Chancellor that weekend, the £6.4 billion overspend this fiscal year. And that was a number that was increasing, not decreasing. And the second biggest component of that £22 billion overspend was £1.9 billion of payments to private rail companies because passenger numbers were not at the levels that were previously predicted, and that was something that was being paid out to those companies. Those were the two biggest components of the overspend. So it was clear when I arrived at the Treasury that the baseline was not the March forecast, but on spending was actually these much higher numbers. In terms of the sort of what the OBR set out in their Dell review, we're using this number of a £9 billion overspend. I think it's just to be clear to understand that the reserve set aside in March, I think it was £12.7 billion. What the OBR are saying is that £12.7 billion, even at the time of the challenge meeting in February, had already been spent or allocated, and another £9.5 billion on top of that. By the time it got to the budget, and this is stuff that the Treasury officials have now published, that had reached £16.8 billion by the time of the budget, and £21.9 billion by the time I became Chancellor. I just also want to just sort of finish by saying, because I don't know what process was gone through at previous budgets, but I can just tell you that what we did in producing our budget totals and spending review totals was very much a bottom-up process, not a top-down Dell number, but going through each department. Now, I know that's different because it was a spending review rather than just a budget, but it was obvious in March that given what had happened to inflation in the preceding 2 or 3 years, that the spending totals were running much higher because of inflation. So just saying that, that there hadn't been a spending review, so you have to have a top-down number, I don't really accept that.
We can go into this in more detail, and I think we've got to think about other things about the budget too. But I would just observe that when an official opposition is an official opposition, I wonder whether there is enough resource for an official opposition to get proper sight of things, because some of these pressures were apparent, or trends were apparent in accounts, but it can be difficult to pull that together. Do you think, as when you were Shadow Chancellor, that you had enough access to information and had sight of things? Obviously, you said you were surprised after the election to be presented with some of these figures. Were you aware even of the trend? I mean, you must have been aware of some of the trends, but what was the biggest and worst surprise for you, and what do you think could help an opposition to be better prepared?
We knew there were big pressures coming down the line. What we didn't know is that they were in the fiscal year that had already started. That was the big surprise, that the baseline that we were starting from did not reflect the true spending pressures. Just lastly say, we asked the Office of Budget Responsibility to make recommendations so that this could never happen again. I have accepted all 10 recommendations from the Office of Budget Responsibility so that this government, or indeed any future government, will not get into this position again.
I mean, beyond the theatre of politics, I mean, what we saw here was, politicians of both parties in good faith dealing with officials, taking advice as best we could, and dealing with those pressures. The previous summer, we knew there were pressures, and we'd settled on terms of the workforces. And we asked those workforces by department, I remember having those conversations, to manage them within the budgets in that year. And so, the assertion that there was a quantum of 22 billion, none of which could have been managed through the ordinary work, perhaps I accept there was going to be some pressure, but it just seems quite wrong to assert that there was that number so definitively on the time you walked into office. Did you have a meeting when 22 billion was explicitly set out with the Permanent Secretary?
Yes, that first weekend when I became Chancellor. Weekend.
So there was 22 billion that first weekend?
Yes. So my first meeting in the Treasury was on the afternoon of the 5th of July, on the Friday afternoon. We then worked all weekend, and it was that weekend that the 22 billion number was put to me when I was Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Okay, and is that document being fully published?
We have now published the line-by-line account of that £22 billion. That was what was published alongside the budget last week, and it was those numbers that I was taken through. You maintain,
Chancellor, that number is, none of that could have been managed through decisions made by Chancellor in terms of departmental trade-offs and underspends?
Well, on the 29th of July, I set out £5.5 billion of savings against that £22 billion. And in the budget, we announced, for example, £4.3 billion of savings on welfare fraud and error, the biggest ever package of welfare fraud and error. So we are making savings. We have made savings, but that
you also made additional choices that were additional pressures during that period in July as well.
If you're referring to public sector pay, well, two of those, first of all, the remits given to the independent pay review bodies were given by the previous government, not this government. And when evidence of affordability was given, there was no number given around what was affordable, which my understanding is pretty unprecedented. So the independent pay review bodies reported in good faith, and at least two of those recommendations were presented before the general election was called on May the 22nd at the Ministry of Defence and for schools. And so those pressures were known by the previous government. The remits were set by the previous government.
Yes, but as you will be advised in subsequent years, the choreography of when you settle is part of the process of resolution. Because if you settle one by one, then you create a dynamic to those resolutions. So it's not unreasonable to have two back and hold them back until you've got the others.
I'm not suggesting that they should have been settled before the election. What I am saying is that those pressures were well known by the government at the time of the general election.
Thank you for answers.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We could go on about this at length, but I think we will now pass to Harriet Baldwin.
For a completely different subject.
Exactly. To move it on a bit.
I want to go back to the IMF again, and it struck me as they welcomed your budget with the sustainably raising revenue quote over the weekend. understand how many of the measures that you've adopted, Chancellor, are from their Article 4 report on the UK economy, and how many things they set out in that report that are part of the framework that you're working with. I'll list them for the record: the relaxation of the Greenbelt restrictions, the enhanced role for the Office for Budget Responsibility, moving to an annual budget cycle, upskilling the workforce, including more assets in the inheritance tax net, bringing the tax rates on capital and labour closer together, crowding in private investment, and more regular spending reviews. And these are all the IMF recommendations that you have taken forward into government. I note, though, that there are a couple of big ones that you've stayed well clear of, and I just want to probe on those two big ones. One is one that you supported yourself in a paper that you published earlier in your career in Parliament, to overhaul council tax and replace it with a broad-based property tax. Is that something that you considered in this budget and you have rejected, or is it something that we can anticipate you will be considering in the future?
It was one of the many things that was put to me as an option. It's not something that we wanted to take forward. People have gone through a massive cost of living crisis these last few years, and increasing council tax above the 5% increase a year that the previous government capped it as, I didn't think would be the right approach. But we were pleased with the sort of clean bill of health that we were given by the International Monetary Fund. They published their Article 4 report on the UK economy just as I was going to Washington for the annual meetings the week before the budget. So I hadn't seen their most recent Article 4 report, although obviously had read previous ones. But I think there are a number of things, as you rightly say, Dame Harriet, that we've done that the IMF have been calling for, both in terms of how to sustainably raise revenue and achieve that fiscal consolidation, which is much needed to get the debt and the deficit down, but also to raise the growth rate, which is something that they're very much focused on.
So you looked at that, you've decided not to do it, and that won't happen in this Parliament.
I'm not going to write 5 years' worth of budgets.
Fair enough.
I've just written one. But I would say that the commitments that we made in our manifesto are for the duration of this Parliament around income tax, employee national insurance, VAT, and indeed capping corporation tax at its current rate.
The second big one that struck me you might do in this budget was around fuel duty, and you've actually extended the 5p off fuel duty for another year. The Office for Budget Responsibility highlights, the risk that eventually we won't actually have any fuel duty because we'll have all have moved to electric cars. And so are you planning during this Parliament to move beyond fuel duty and to introduce a system of road pricing?
We're not looking at road pricing. I think you make a fair challenge. At the moment, though, the focus is trying to increase the uptake of electric vehicles. We've fallen behind the target that the previous government set for the rollout of electric vehicles. And that has an impact as well on manufacturers who will be fined under the rules of the previous government set out for not selling a certain proportion, I think it's 80% by 2030, of electric vehicles. So one of the things that we would try to achieve in the budget was to keep those incentives and enhance those incentives for the take-up of electric vehicles. Although on fuel duty, there are two reasons why I decided to not increase fuel duty or indeed reverse the cut that was introduced during the pandemic. And that was partly because the cost of living crisis is still biting. Look, inflation's come down massively, but obviously that higher level of prices is locked in, and the higher interest rates, which are, have come down since the election, but they're still at much higher levels than when people took out their mortgages, that it was the wrong thing to do. It was actually be a 7p increase if we reverse both of those things. And second, with everything going on in the Middle East, this felt like the wrong time to start increasing fuel prices, because we don't know what's going to happen in the next few months announced with the conflict in the Middle East, and I didn't think under that backdrop of huge uncertainty that it would have been the right time to do that.
But it is baked in for next year.
It is baked in, as it
year.
was for the previous government, but it did not feel, given the cost of living challenges that families and businesses continue to face, and given the uncertainty in the Middle East, that it would have been the right policy approach at the moment.
Great. And the final recommendation the IMF had was that the family home should attract capital gains tax on sale, and I assume you've ruled that one out.
We'll not be doing that.
Okay, thank you.
Very much, Dame Harriet. And I would just say, I'm sure the Chancellor would love to be here for a lot longer, but if the Chancellor could answer slightly shorter, and Bobby Dean is going to be an exemplar in shorter questions from the committee, we will give the Chancellor time for a cup of tea before votes. Not that we're necessarily worried about you having a cup of tea before votes, but we're nice people. So if we can be a bit sharper, that would be helpful. Mr. Dean.
I'm best chair. And can I add my congratulations to you as well, even though it's late in the meeting. I haven't had a chance to say it yet. I want to move on to employer national insurance contributions. I know there's been a lot of conversation around it, particularly focusing on the OBR's forecasting in relation to it. They talk about the effect on wages and employment. There was lots of discussion yesterday how they see this as a key drag on the growth forecast as well. And obviously results in declining revenues over the course of the Parliament. Now, you indicated earlier on that you kind of accepted the OBR's forecast, and you might have some come back later on with policies like planning reform adding into that growth forecast. But do you accept their analysis and their assessment of the impact on wages and employment over the forecast period?
Well, thank you very much, and we haven't had a chance to work together before, and look forward to taking questions from you today and in the future on this Select Committee, and congratulations on your election. I'm not going to dispute the independent analysis of the Office of Budget Responsibility. I've got a huge amount of respect for the work they do and the detail that goes into their forecasting. When we inherited the fiscal position that we inherited, we had to make some difficult choices about how we were going to plug that gap between the amount of money that was being spent and the spending plans that we inherited and what we had coming in. Now, look, there were some people who said that the previous government cut national insurance on employees under a false pretense, the pretense being that the money was there to actually be able to afford those cuts to national insurance. So there were some people who argued, including the former Bank of England Governor Mervyn King, that we should just take employee national insurance back to where it was before. I think that would have been the wrong approach for two reasons. First of all, it would have been in direct breach of our manifesto commitment, and I do think trust in politics is really important. But second, to put all of that burden directly and immediately on working people that they would see in their payslips, I thought that was the wrong approach. Now, what we've done with the increase in employer national insurance is leave it to the business to work out how to absorb it. Now, businesses are amazingly creative and have great ingenuity. And one of the things they do really well is drive efficiency and productivity performance. And so some of this increase in national insurance will be absorbed through efficiency and productivity gains. Some of it will be absorbed through profits. And as the OBR say, there will down the line be an impact on wage growth. Although I'm really pleased that if you look at as a whole of the package of measures that we've announced, wages increase, real household disposable income increases, in sharp contrast to what we saw under the last government, which was the worst parliament on record for living standards. I'll just say one other thing. When we put together the plan that we presented at the budget on national insurance, I listened really carefully to what the Federation of Small Businesses have said, and that's that small businesses struggle most with national insurance contributions. And so we increased the employment allowance from £5,000 to £10,500. So a NICS bill that would have been less than £10,500, you don't pay any NICS whatsoever. And that means around 1 million smaller businesses are either paying no more national insurance or indeed less national insurance than they were previously. So we were pleased, and that's one of the virtues of the way we put together this package.
Yeah, clearly it was a choice, but
yep.
You had many economic choices in front of you, but maybe narrowed some of your political choices by what you'd said in advance of an election, the commitments you made in your manifesto. And given the way that the OBR have assessed it, it's impacted on growth, would you like to have had a wider set of economic choices in front of you when you came to make that decision? And in particular, an awful lot of the revenue is attributed to the change in the threshold. and that's had a particular impact on low-wage workers. We heard yesterday how it means that almost every income level is going to feel worse off by the end of this Parliament once you take into account all the tax and benefit changes. I'm referring to Resolution Foundation research in particular. So are you concerned about how this change has impacted low-wage workers, particularly those in sectors like hospitality and retail?
I think it's really important to note that there is a floor beneath which wages can't fall, and that's just gone up by 6.7% for the national living wage increase, and it's gone up by more for workers aged between 18 and 21. So the lowest paid workers will not see any of the national insurance increase passed on to them, because it would be illegal to take wages below the floor. So there is that protection there for the lowest paid workers. I was also really pleased that if you look at box 2A of the autumn budget fixing the foundations document and the distributional analysis, actually the only group that are worse off are the top decile. And I think that shows that we've got the balance right in this budget by asking those with the highest incomes, those with the broadest shoulders, to bear a bit more of the burden.
That's exactly the graph that I dispute, actually. I think you might be talking about this one here. But the IFS...
This is 2A, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I've got 1A actually in front of me, sorry. But the IFS said yesterday that that distributional analysis, I'm talking about figure 1.A, didn't include the impact of the national insurance contribution changes. And Resolution Foundation, when they made an attempt at this themselves, you're right about the spread being similar, but everybody ends up losing out in some respects. So I don't know if you've got further comment about the way that change was implemented, in particular threshold, having that impact.
Let me say something about that, and then I want to answer the earlier question about the choices that you rightly said we did have choices about the way in which to plug this gap. So the way the Treasury has always done their analysis has looked at direct taxes on people and also the impact of spending decisions on people, because the extra money for the NHS is felt by patients that use the NHS, and the extra money for schools is felt by people who have got children at state schools. So that's how the Treasury has always done their distributional analysis. And maybe I'll pass to Will to say a little bit more about that. But I do want to come back to this issue that you rightly say, Mr. Dean, about choices.
Mr. McFarlane.
Really just echoing what the Chancellor said, the approach we've taken in I think you've got 1A from the distributional analysis document. The Chancellor's got the same chart repeated in 2A in the Red Book, so they're exactly the same. That is the approach we've taken consistently under the previous government as well, to modelling the direct impact on households of changes in taxes and benefits that impact directly on households, and also because of the data available to the Treasury on public spending, where the years for which we've set public spending plans, the benefit effectively that flows to households across the income distribution and typically from public services further down the income distribution. So we are able to present it like that. It's consistent with what we've done previously. To take resolutions analysis, I know Dr. Brewer spoke to you yesterday. They've made some assumptions, building on what the OBR have made as their assumptions of in later years what pass-through from the employer NICs changes could look like. We do not take those assumptions in the Treasury's analysis because it's on firm data next year of changes to household benefits and taxes and changes in public spending that we know. So it's on firm facts. We totally respect the approach. They don't also choose to model public services numbers. They don't have that technology and that data. So there are different approaches here. I think what you also heard yesterday, including from Mr. Brewer, Dr. Brewer, but also I think from Yale Selfin and indeed from Professor Miles, is that these are very uncertain estimates of how these things pass through. Yes. The OBR have taken some assumptions. As the Chancellor has explained, different businesses in different sectors will absorb this change in certain ways. We have sought to protect lower paid through other moves, such as on the national living wage, in the budget, and also other reliefs within NICs, for example, for under 21s, under 25 apprentices remain in place, and the changes to the employment allowance. So hopefully factually there on the different approaches in distributional analysis, and very established on our part, but also in way in which the whole package is designed.
Thank you, Chancellor. And then
I just want to answer the earlier question about were there other choices. So as as I said, we could have reversed the cut to employee national insurance contributions, but I think that would have been the wrong thing to do. Another thing that we could have done, which is what the previous government did to raise money, was to freeze thresholds for longer. Now, I know that this was a big package, £40 billion worth of tax increases, but the threshold freezes in the previous Parliament actually raised 45 billion. They raised more than the previous government had planned when they made them because inflation and therefore wage growth were higher. But those threshold freezes were worth 45 billion pounds, more than the tax increases announced in the budget last week. We could have continued down that path.
So, just be clear, the timescales. The budget is what? This is this year, and you're comparing several.
But what
years.
I'm comparing
I see
is,
the point,
yes, but what I'm saying is there are other ways to raise this money.
Yes,
we could have frozen thresholds for longer on a wider range of taxes. I don't think that was the right approach. Again, a lot of people were speculating and arguing that we should have frozen income tax and national insurance thresholds for a further 2 years, beyond which the previous government had already set out. That would have taken more money out of the pockets of working people. I don't think that would have been the right approach, but it is an alternative approach that I could have taken last week.
Yep. Mr. Dean, all about choices, as we hear. Yeah,
and I totally accept there is uncertainty about how this may take effect. I think yesterday they said 75% was their central forecast. It could be anywhere between 66 to 90%, so it could go either way. But just one final sort of potentially unforeseen consequence of this policy is on your mission to move more of healthcare into the community and out of hospitals, an admirable mission which I would support, but then the impact of employer NICs on NHS associated services like GPs, care operators, voluntary organisations that might be delivering NHS services, they're all going to face this additional cost. We've got information from the NHS Confederation here, so they're extremely concerned about their ability to deliver this, and though we've had this big cash injection, it may be undermined by this change. Are you going to consider not necessarily exemptions, but any compensatory activity for these organisations too?
Thank you very much for that question. First of all, this is the approach that governments take when making compensation. Otherwise, you'd be making arbitrary decisions around what's public and what's private. This is the definitions of what the public sector is, and that's what's being compensated for. But let me just say this. You've spoken particularly around health services. As you know, we made a £22.6 billion commitment for day-to-day spending over the 1.5 2 year period in the budget last week. The Health Secretary making allocations in the usual way for GPs, for example, and for local government, there was a 3.2% real terms increase in their budgets next year, including £600 million for social care. So we're confident within the settlements that we've made that those costs can be absorbed.
Just final, on social care, that £600 million, is that the totality we're pledging towards social care? Because that would mean for every £97 we're spending on the NHS, it's £3 on social care. Lots of people see the opportunity for unlocking social care reform, freeing up money for the NHS. Is that the extent of the pledge to social care in this budget?
Well, we've done a 3.2% real terms increase for local government, including 600 million additional money for social care. That's phase one of the spending review. As the Health Secretary has said in the spring, we'll be setting out the 10-year plan for health, including looking at social care.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Lola McAvoy.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr McFarlane, for outlining that it is not predetermined by the budget how businesses implement their NICs rises. And I think some of the forecasting has been as if that is predetermined, but it's not. And in my previous role, I've spent time working with brilliant businesses who go further than the government minimum and look after their employees very well. So I encourage businesses to look at other options. I was going to follow on from Mr Dean's point, but I think because we've addressed that, I want to just quickly highlight a question about with this cross-departmental approach that Mr Smewing outlined and the impact-driven approach that we're going to be having going forward in this government, the huge amount of investment that's coming in through National Wealth Fund, that will create, or is intended, as far as I'm aware, to create jobs in different areas. Will those jobs be included by the Office for Value for Money when they're evaluating the tax receipts about those investments? So is there a correlation between the Office for Value for Money, the National Wealth Fund investment, the jobs and the taxes that come from the jobs being higher wages in those areas?
Chancellor, or do you want to ask Mr Smewing to take that?
Do you want to pick that one up?
Your break, Chancellor.
So when the Office for Value for Money is looking at the value for money of policies, including the National Wealth Funds, if that's where it ends up focusing, it would be looking at all of the impacts of that. So, that would be both impacts on the economy and impacts on the output of public services. I think the focus of the Office for Value for Money, particularly for phase 2 of the spending review, is really going to be a lot about how we get the most out of public services we are already operating, and how to do those most efficiently, and how to ensure that things like the capital programme is delivered effectively. But it will be looking across a range of things. And if it does look at the National Wealth Fund, I'm sure that the broader impacts of that would be part of its considerations. I should say it'd be the Office for Budget Responsibility would think about the macroeconomic impact of something like the National Wealth Fund and the crowding in of investment that it would do. So they would be picking that up in their forecasts.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Rachel Reeves.
Congratulations, Chancellor. These are my questions, so I want to offer you my congratulations into this role. We wanted to move now to departmental spending. We've talked quite a bit about efficiency and monitoring of impact, but I wanted to look at the unprotected departments and the impact of spending in those in 25-26, and to really probe on how that would be managed. This is a question really about risk and pressure in the next few years, should those pressures arise, given the widespread acknowledgement that this budget is front-loaded. So how likely is it that we might need to increase spending next March?
We've now set the envelope for spending for this Parliament, and we're not going to be coming back with more tax increases or indeed with more borrowing. We now need to live within the means that we have set ourselves in the budget and those allocations of spending totals. Just in terms of what that package means, day-to-day spending is now forecast to grow at an average of 2% per year in real terms between 23-24 and 29-30, and obviously we've already announced the first sort of year and a half worth of those allocations. So this is a significant increase in spending, both in terms of day-to-day spending, but also crucially in capital spending, which can help drive productivity and efficiency improvements in day-to-day spending as well.
Can I just come back on social care, which we've started to talk about here? We've looked at the front-loading of spending, particularly on the Department of Health, and the 600 million specifically into social care. What assessment has been made of the level of interaction between health and social care, and how we might see the benefits of that front-loading from health feeding into efficiency within social care?
These are things that absolutely in the second stage of the spending review we want to do more of. I'll just go back to the sort of points that I made earlier to, I think, the Chair's question about this. In the second phase of the spending review, we're going to be looking from the bottom up, the zero-based approach, to make sure that we're driving value for money. And also sort of linking back to an earlier answer, I think, to Yuan Yang's question about cross-government working. It's really important in the second phase of the spending review. We're not just looking at this department by department, but we're looking at the outcomes, and that's what the mission boards and the mission approach to government should enable us to deliver. Because you're absolutely right that spending on social care through local government can reduce pressures in the health budget, and so it is important as we go into the second phase of the spending review, we look at outcomes, not just departmental silos.
Very much.
Thank you very much. John Denby.
Could I ask about the tax view you have about competitiveness and tax? If you add up the increases in national insurance, the retention of the corporation tax rate, the changes to CGT, and other changes to business property relief, obviously you made a lot of emphasis about the distributional impact of it. But in terms of those that invest in the UK, being concerned when they also think about the 5 billion from the Employment Rights Act, is concern and how you're managing that concern and evaluating the overall impact on those that are prepared to invest, because a lot of emphasis of this budget has been about investment in public sector reform, which you've given a reasoned analysis of why in terms of getting people back to work, etc. But what's the bottom line in terms of the impact and increases in tax? 179 billion is a lot. Is there a limit on how high taxes can go?
This budget was a reset budget. We're not going to be repeating a budget like this again.
No
I said to Dame Harriet, I'm not going to write 5 years worth of budgets. Imagine if that had been done in 2019. So one of had all the tax increases that we had.
Taxes then?
Well, look, it would be naive to try and guess. You started this session, Mr. Glenn, with uncertainties about what's happening in the global economy. I'm not going to write 5 years worth of budgets now, but we have now drawn a line under the unrealistic path for public spending, and also the trajectory for public finances, and put those on a firm footing. In terms of what I would say to business, alongside the budget last Wednesday, we published a corporate tax roadmap, which has been widely welcomed by business, capping corporation tax at its current rate of 25% for the duration of this Parliament. There were numerous changes to the rate of corporation tax in the last Parliament, which was not good and not welcomed by business. Alongside that, a commitment again for the permanent full expensing, and also the £1 million annual investment allowance, and the R&D budget, £20 billion next year. We also published a consultation on business rates as we move to a fairer system there, but also a system that encourages in investment. We had to raise money in the budget last week. I think we've done that in a balanced way, balanced when it comes to what we've done on carried interest and capital gains tax, etc. as well.
Can I just ask you one specific question about the APR changes that you brought in? Because I see that we're talking about the 3 million relief, and then which the Prime Minister spoke about at PMQs. But would you not accept that even if you want to target it at large wealthy people who buy vast tracts of land, that you could have looked at business asset rollover relief, and if you had a higher threshold, you would then save, even up to 5 or 7 million, you would save a large number of farms that just do not have the liquidity. And the only way they can secure that liquidity is to sell land, which is part of the food production, food security, national security equation. Is there any scope for the business asset rollover relief, whereby people sell businesses, put it into land, secure the deferral of CGT by buying additional assets, could be used as an alternative mechanism? And the apparent lack of an assessment of how far that affects functioning food producers in this country, is alarming a lot of people. I recognise the imperative around raising more money, but the impact on this, despite your commitment to save the DEFRA budget, is quite profound to the countryside.
Let me start with answering directly this issue about paying the bill when there is a bill, and then I'll take you through how the sort of numbers stack up. I want to be really clear that for those estates where there is going to be an inheritance tax bill, that bill can be paid over a 10-year time period, interest-free. That doesn't exist for anyone else paying inheritance tax, but we thought it was right for the reasons that you've set out.
They make about 1% profit. Yeah. So even on a say an £8 million farm, which isn't that significant, with the 3 million relief, you're talking about $1 million. So it's 100,000 a year for 10 years. Now 100,000 a year in terms of income for a farm is a massive amount of money. So I recognise the bigger picture. Let me then come to
the issue around the taxation of the estates. In the last year that data was available, 2021-22, of all the claims for agricultural property relief, the average claim was just under £500,000. 73% of claims for less than £1 million.
If the denominator is a hobby farm with 3 acres, you will increase that 73% number. to 73%, it doesn't do justice to the reality of the distribution of land and the asset price and the liquidity that will be vested by selling land.
In the last year of data available, 40% of the of agricultural property relief went to 7% of estates, and 22% of relief went to 2% of estates. That was worth, let me just finish this point, that was worth £119 million that went to just 37 estates. It is not possible to continue the rate of support that was previously available. I think we have got a fair balance, and I think working with farmers to explain how this new system will work. I recognise that since 1992 there hasn't been inheritance tax on agricultural property, and so this is a change in the system. It doesn't come in until April 2026.
And that will allow some time for planning. But what I would say is I recognise the distribution. I'm not disputing that. But I'm just questioning whether there's more an effective mechanism to capture that small proportion of large landowners that you are focusing on and is the focus of your narrative, rather than the impact on a very long tail of functioning farms who are ill-equipped to sell tracts of land, even over a 10-year interest-free payment period, and that is going to cause significant harm.
I'm happy to write with you with more details about the distribution. I'll write to you, Chair, with the information, but we think we've got the right balance, given the need to raise money and given the fact that all communities, including rural communities, rely on stable public finances because of the cost of capital and also a well-functioning education and health system.
Thank you, Chancellor.
Thank you. We will. I think there's a number of detailed points that we could have gone into in more detail, but we're already going over time, so we'll write to you on a number of issues. Lucy Rigby.
A very quick question, Chancellor. I wanted to get to the data point, because I'm conscious that in the budget we talk about the better use of data sharing across departments. So my question is just how important is that to you? Presumably you see benefits in it, but how important is it to you, and what level of priority would you give it?
Want to say something about that?
I think Conrad.
Yes. The short answer is it is very important. So one of the things that we've announced in the budget is the creation of a national data library to allow access in a kind of simple, ethical and secure way for public sector data assets to give researchers and businesses kind of insights into what that data can demonstrate to them. That's really important for all of the kinds of things that we were talking about before, about doing proper evaluation of the impact of public policies. And that is a resource which is like at present underused, which in the National Data Library we can kind of get much more out of, and they help improve productivity both in public services and the private sector in future.
I'm really interested as well in the possibility of targeting economic support to households, which presumably greater data sharing allows as well.
That sort of thing is exactly the sort of thing that you could be able to do if you can get this right.
Thank you. So much we could talk about on data sharing and how much easier it would be to forecast, project, and model and check things. But can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time. I mean, to summarise, today we've heard some very robust statements from the Chancellor about the spending envelope, and I think spending departments will be listening. I'm not sure eagerly is quite the word, but listening and getting the message very clearly. And also that the Chancellor believes that her economic plan will surpass the OBR's forecast for economic growth, so we'll be holding her to account on that. We also heard that the UK will continue to be an open global trading partner, and we will be a global advocate for free trade, and that was obviously in particular in light of the recent election of President Trump in America. And the Chancellor has been very clear that she will not conduct another large fiscal event in this Parliament, in this reset in this Parliament. So, but you also have promised, Chancellor, that you will come in front of us more than just at fiscal events. So we look forward to nailing down with you. You may regret that promise, but no, hopefully we've been a friendly bunch, even if we have to question you as robustly as we want to. So we would hope that you could come in front of us again and we can pin that down. And also we've heard very clearly from the Chancellor that some departments will need to stop doing some things. in order to make sure that the budget's balanced. And I'm sure my colleagues chairing other select committees will be looking to tackle their respective departments on these points in detail. And finally, I just wanted to say we've had some exchange, obviously, with the Permanent Secretary in particular about the relationship between the OBR and whether or not the law was broken. Certainly the MOU may have not been quite followed to the letter from what you've said, but we will obviously keep a close eye on how the new rules work, and we may consider what we do about that. And we also, I just wanted to reiterate the point that I made in the budget debate, Chancellor, that it would be I think it's important that announcements about fiscal events are made to the House of Parliament or through Parliament, through this committee to Parliament as appropriate, and I hope that you'll commit to doing that in future. That's a nod. Is that for Hansard? Or?
I think that we did make the budget announcements in the budget. I think it was important in terms of the fiscal rules to indicate to markets how the investment and stability rules would work. But even those, the measure we were using, the time frame to meeting our rules, all of that was announced to Parliament.
Okay, well, there were some, we can get into, I'm not going to get into detail about some of the other announcements made by other members of the government, but I think the point has been made, and we look forward to seeing the Chancellor and officials again. I believe we're going to be doing some future work on the work of the Treasury. It looks like we're going to Darlington. We're being tempted to go to Northampton as well. And clearly there's a bid to have another Treasury outlet where King John relocated the Treasury to in 1205. So there's a future growth bid for you, Chancellor. But can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time.
Thank you.
Order.
Thank you.